To those waiting with bated breath for that favorite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast, a place of learning for those who aspire to leadership excellence. Here's our host, Mike Etor.
Rose Fass has over 40 years of experience in technology and consumer-based industries. During her impressive career, Rose has opened new businesses in the United States, been a general manager with full P&L responsibility, and led major corporate transformations. As the Chief Transformation Officer at Xerox, Rose led the transition to the global industry and solutions business, integrating acquisitions, diverse cultures, and operating units to develop and execute the enterprise strategy. She joined the Gartner Group in 2000 and established a Center for Business Transformation, a center of excellence aimed at transforming their business model from analog to digital. A dynamic speaker, Rose is frequently invited to speak at private and public sector events. She is featured in Fortune's Most Powerful Women of 2022 and in Entrepreneur 100 Women of Influence in Westchester, and is listed in Forbes 2012 Top 10 Women Business Leaders in New York. She's the author of The Chocolate Conversation, Lead Bittersweet Change, Transform Your Business, and her more recent book, The Leadership Conversation, Make Bold Change One Conversation at a Time. And we're going to discuss this book today during our conversations. Rose has a wealth of experience, and I am just so pleased she's here. Rose, welcome to the Leadership Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, I am too. I have, don't take this word literally, I have stalked you on social media for quite a while and listened to you and on other podcasts. So you're the real deal, and I appreciate your experience and most of all to come here and share it. But listen, you've got a rich background. The intro was just scratching the surface. What more do we need to know about Rose Fass personally and professionally?
Yeah, I always think when I hear those bios, and we have to put them together, right? I always think, God, I sound like a big piece of stuff. I'm actually, an American Italian. I grew up in East Utica, New York. My mother and dad were, Depression babies, and my dad later went into the Marine Corps during World War II. And my brother Perry and I, the two of us at that time, were the beginning of his family. And my mother, and I remember him saying, I have a rich man's family. I have a boy and a girl. And they were the children of immigrants. So we were the first generation born of American parents. And then my younger brother came along. So I had a very humble beginning. My father came back from the Marine Corps, and he was going to university on a GI Bill. And he was driving a little truck around, a cleaning truck around, which I write about in my book. And that's where I learned the art of having conversations. So my dad managed to be conversant in all the Romance languages. So he could kind of talk to anybody. And he used to say, listen deeply. Everybody has a story, and we need to hear it. And people need to be heard. So I think most of my career I have spent with the little lessons that I learned from my grandfather, who never really learned to speak English fully. And my mom and my dad and the people around me in my nuclear family that were all, coming out of a depression and just making their way in the world. And so that's something, as I look at all of this, yes, I do have an extensive background, but it started very humble.
Yeah. Well, some trivia. I was born in Schenectady, New York. I lived there until I was 10. Italian immigrant grandparents. All my grandparents came from Naples, Italy area. And so my paternal grandfather and grandmother came from Italy, and they settled in Schenectady, and my granddad worked at the very first GE plant.
Absolutely. I was
That's
there.
where he worked.
I was there. And interestingly enough, Mike, my parents are Calabrese on both sides, from Calabria, my grandparents. And We moved from Utica, and when I was 10 years old, we moved to Amsterdam, which was very close to Schenectady. And later in
Yeah.
my career, I ended up at that GE plant. And I remember they didn't have women's rooms. They only had the men's room. And I went in, and the man said to me, we do have a private bathroom for our head of the company, our chairman. You could use that. And I said, thank you so much. And I remember.
Yes, yes. Well, the other piece of trivia comes from you. I've noticed in all of your podcast interviews and your articles, you actually grew up with a net funicello.
Yes, it's a signature story. My dad, interestingly enough, was a warrior. He was you also were in the Marine Corps. So being in the
Yeah.
Marine Corps at the age of 18 years, as a means to survive, really, and wanting to defend your country, his best friend Bruno asked him to go in to become tail gunners. So Dad was like, why would we want to do that? We'll get shot down. And Bruno says, it's better in the air than it is being shot on the ground. So Dad goes, and Bruno doesn't get in. My father does. Later, only to find out there was something like an 85% mortality rate in the first 2 weeks, and then it dropped to 55. It was not good. But there was Dad in the back of a tail gun of a plane, I guess the B-2. I don't remember exactly the bomber. Long story short, by the grace of God, he came home. And so he didn't have a great deal of patience for my whining that Annette Funicello was discovered by Disney and the rest of us little girls were left behind. We were all Italian, and we were all dark haired, and we were all cute. We could all dance. So we didn't understand that. Of course, she was 5 years older than us. And we were bad. I mean, we walked down the street and said things like, well, her father, he runs a gas station. I mean, we did really not nice things and said bad things. And I remember my dad getting very annoyed by this. And my mother was like, Rosemarie, darling, we see down the street, but God sees around the corner, and your time's going to come. And I'm like, well, when? Tuesday? I mean, do I have to wait to go to California? Anyway, one day I'm walking down, and from living in Schenectady and growing up there, winters are very long.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, this was an unusual early May day when you could sort of feel a breath of some of what was coming. End of April, early May. And my dad was plucking dandelions out of the ground. This is the story that I open with in the book. And it's Friday. And I'm down in the dumps, still crying over the fact that I have not been discovered by Walt Disney. And I'm walking past him, and you never knew whether you were going to get the Marine or you were going to get the philosopher. So he was a published poet. So Rose, and I'm like, oh no. So I go back, yes, Dad. He pulls this dandelion up. He goes, what do you see? I said, Dad, I see a dandelion. And he goes, I want you to look a little deeper than that. I want you to look a little wider, and I want you to think what this represents and tell me what else you see. And at that point, I did not have the emotional energy to deal with this. I mean, I'm like 9 years old, not in the mood. And Annette's going to be in Disney, and me and Lucy Caputo are stuck behind. And there's Dad. And I became the queen of rhetorical responses. So I looked over at him and I said, I don't know, Dad, what do you see? And he smiled knowingly. And he said, I see the end of a very long winter, the beginning of a new dawn. I see children frolicking in their front yards and picking these and giving them their mothers, put in juice glasses and set them on kitchen windowsills. I see lovers walking hand in hand, exchanging them in silent I love yous. And I just felt like I was going to start to cry. And I said, you see a lot, Dad. And he said, Rose, this once beautiful expression of spring has only a moment of glory until the daffodils come and the tulips and the prettier flowers. And this will become a weed, a distortion to the lawn. And I, like many homeowners, will go to the nurseries, get the chemicals to try and burn this thing out of the lawn so we don't have to deal with it anymore. And I looked at him. The beauty of the dandelion isn't in its head and its flower when it shows its face to introduce spring. It's in the root. It's in its resilience. And I looked at him and he said, your mother and I, we've named you Rose. Roses are fragile. In your heart, you need to be a dandelion. I didn't fully get it that day. I got it to some extent because I really followed my dad around a lot, and I was more the one that enjoyed the philosophy than my two brothers, but I cried in the arms of that Marine for a long time until it was all cried out. And then for some reason, I felt better. Many, many, many years later, I was coming back from work, and it was a very difficult day. It was when I had started the company, and there was a documentary on Annette, and she had gotten MS, and she was in pretty bad shape. And it flew into my head, that story, and my mom saying, we see down the street, but God sees around the corner. And I thought, would I change lives with her now? And it hit me, that I had spent the majority of my life as a dandelion, kind of trying to be resilient and getting through it.
What a profound story. And obviously, yeah, I've heard you say this in the past on other podcasts. So obviously, a lifetime moment at that point when he gave you the dandelion story for the first time. So thanks for sharing that with us. Let's talk a little bit about your company, Rose. I always try and give some orientation up front to the listeners. What's your company do? Who's the clients, and what problems do you help them solve?
That's a very good question. So we started the company in 2001. And I want to share, I always tend to share things in stories, so I'll make this brief. I had left Xerox after 23 years as their chief transformation officer, my last job, retired, early retirement. And I went with Bill McDermott, the now CEO of ServiceNow, to Gartner. And I met a classically trained engineer there, Gavin McMahon. And he was 6 feet tall, very smart, wore glasses, and had a British accent. So when Gartner kind of went through its own turmoil and kind of ousted their CEO and a lot of things happened, we ended up, I started the Center for Business Transformation that I'd done in Xerox there, and it was the genesis of what Fast Forward would become. I suggested to Gavin that he join me since we were both kind of out of work. It wasn't going to work at Gartner. And he said, really? We have nothing in common. And when we first met, he said, I put people in two categories, idiot and okay. I had you in the idiot category. Now I kind of think you're okay. Very bright guy. But I had it in my head when I started the company that to drive credibility and to earn it, having a male-female team was smart. Having an attractive male with a British accent and glasses who looked smart, even though he was, could help as well. And so we started out in the beginning and basically would solve any problem that a company came to us with. So early days, Estee Lauder was putting together acquisition with a very funky new line that people were kind of not sure how Estee Lauder would be with a young line. They've got the Bobbi Browns and all that kind of thing. And we took that on and we started doing cultural kinds of things with that company. Basically, my first boss told me, when you start out building a business, say yes to everything that you know you can do, and yes to some of the things you're not quite sure you can do, but you think you can do. And just make sure that you don't get involved with bad business, because bad business is worse than no business. So today, I think we're solving the same problems, Mike. I think we're solving problems around leadership gaps, cultural mishaps, like when you acquire a company and they're great for you revenue-wise, but they're not good for you DNA-wise. We help people build their narrative, be able to tell a story as opposed to just share information. So storytelling and leadership are the two prongs that we spend a lot of time on, and those things shape culture and they shape the destiny of a company. And we work with from the C-suite all the way through the front line. And believe it or not, we always say our customers are famous, or our businesses that we work with are famous. We're not. But we work with Fortune 15 companies and they stay with us. They stay with us. And we're in business now 23 years.
I've seen that on your other writings and all of that. You have a good client retention, and that speaks for itself. Um, Rose, I wanted to ask you if you were limited to 2 or 3 sentences just to give us your basic leadership philosophy before we go into a deeper. What's just a few lines? What's your philosophy of leadership?
Yeah, and I think I've boiled it down to this. Leadership happens in the conversation or not. Leadership is messy. And if you want to be perfect, don't sign up to be a good leader.
Yeah, yeah. How about this? The timeless question: leaders born or made?
And I've had that argument with myself for a long time. I think my dad was a born leader. I think he got made more in the Marine Corps. Then I look at a guy like Zelensky. I'm not sure he was a born leader, but I know a moment happened in his life where he stopped being a comedian, became the head of a country, and got hit with something that none of us would have ever anticipated. And he stepped up and he stepped into it. So I believe that you can give people the experiences, the skills, and the knowledge to be a good leader. I think they then have to have the willingness and the, how would I say this? The ability to accept the fact that they're not going to be perfect, that it is going to be messy, that they're going to have to take risks, that they'll fail, and that vulnerability helps you grow and learn. So do I think you can make a leader if they truly want that? Yes. But I don't necessarily think you can force people to lead. There are very, very good managers out there, Mike. You've met them in your career, and they will always be phenomenal managers of work and good supervisors of people. They're not leaders.
Yeah. Right. Right. We're totally aligned on that relative to your dad and others. I do think there are people that are born, much like musical talent, athletic talent, academic. I think some people are born with natural leadership aptitude.
Absolutely.
And if they work at it, they get even better. But
Yeah.
there are some people, I've seen people, and I know you have too, that apparently have no leadership aptitude and they work at it. And it's not too long before they're adequate. And then ultimately, some of them get really good. I mean, they put in the reps, to your point. They're resilient. They fail. They get up. They dust themselves off. And so I use that as a source of encouragement to everybody who said, well, I don't even look like a leader. I'm not sure I am. You can do it if you're willing.
Whatever a leader looks like. Look at Winston
Yeah.
Churchill. He had a mouthful of marbles. He wasn't exactly attractive. Messy as hell. Messy as hell.
Yeah.
And for those young people that are listening to this podcast, when we talk about, Winnie, this was during World War II. But here's a guy who came in and literally might have been associated with saving civilization. So you don't always, it's not about how you look or how you speak. It's really bigger than that, isn't it?
Yes, I agree. I'm a huge Winston Churchill fan. Very complex, very complex. But my favorite story about him is when he was very witty, quick comebacks, and as you know, razor sharp. And some woman, he aggravated some woman, and she said, "Sir, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your tea." And he said, "Madam, if I was your husband, I would drink it."
I think, and he was that way. I mean, I always feel like these people obviously were before I became an adult, I would have loved to have met them, to sit down and meet with these people, because look at
Yeah.
Goldie. I just was watching Golda, and Helen Mirren just did a spectacular. I've never
Yeah.
seen a performance like that ever.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I said to myself, a chain smoker, not very attractive at all,
Yeah.
matronly, wearing these old
Yeah.
lady shoes and walking to the front lines, and they would have followed her into hell. It's like an amazing thing, isn't it?
It
So
really was.
it has very
Leader.
little to do. I think also it's when your time comes to be a leader. You have moments. Leadership happens in the moment. Doesn't happen. You don't plan for it. So I think of Rosa Parks. She's sitting on a bus. She's an ordinary lady, and she's in the back, and she's tired. And this Caucasian man comes and stands in front of her, and she just silently refuses to get up. Why? Because in her mind, she's thinking, this is not a good practice. Not fair. Why should I have to give up my seat to this able-bodied guy? And it turns out that in that moment of silence, she's told by the conductor, who comes down and says to her, the bus driver, we'll have to bring the police, and we'll have to turn you in. You're breaking the law. And she said, you may do so. Very calm. I don't think in that moment, Mike, she ever thought she would be in history books, or that her grandchildren would read about her, or that Mandela would come off a plane calling her name. She made a decision, a quiet decision to lead. So it's not always demonstrative. Sometimes it's just those silent moments when you just decide, no.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say, and I'll let you speak on this, not only do those silent moments speak, but people are watching and listening always. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I often think of the people on that bus. There were a lot of people of color put their heads down. They were scared.
Yeah.
They were scared. And she pushed through her fear. That's not easy. So I do think that people do watch. I think they do see. And I'd rather live with having messed up than live with regret for not having done what I could have done.
Yeah, yeah, well said. Well, let's get into your book a bit. That the book is titled The Leadership Conversation, Make Bold Change, One Conversation at a Time. So the basic question, why did you write the book, and what audience is it aimed at?
I actually wrote the book because the chocolate conversation was about 6 or 7 years old. I was writing during the pandemic. It gave me something to do. And you've written books, Mike, so it's not an easy job. It takes up a lot of your time and energy.
Right.
I wrote it because I was really listening to the conversation around the pandemic. I was listening to Fauci. I was listening to Trump. I was listening to people from the Democratic Party, people from the Republican Party, citizens, Mario Cuomo, because I was in New York. I was listening to Andrew Cuomo, rather. I was listening to all of them, and I was thinking about, Andrew Cuomo was doing those broadcasts every day. And I thought to myself, look at all these conversations that are going on. And we were making some bold changes during that time, whether we realized it or not. People were forced to reflect. They were eating dinners with their families for the first time. Road warriors were back at home. We thought we'd be gone for 2 weeks. We ended up in 2 years. And before the whole George Floyd crisis, I started to think that the universe gave us a universal timeout, that we were being told, stop, think. And I thought we had a lot of conversations with ourselves. So it came to me that I needed to write about what was happening then and update the chocolate conversation. It was intended to be a sequel. And then Gavin, true to form, comes to me and says, you got to write a new book. Can't make it all about the sequel. It's got to be a new book. And I'm like halfway through my outline, and I'm like, I really hate you, And then I went back, and Bill McDermott said to me in the foreword of my first book, Rose Knows, that conversations, you bow change one conversation at a time. And I was watching it happen in real life. And then, that change can happen for good or bad. And I saw after the George Floyd crises, and as Fauci got further involved in whether we really needed the mask or didn't needed the mask and all this, that we started getting into a sort of vitriol that I didn't love. And I was wondering, what do we need to do differently here? Because there certainly was enough going on that I'm in the transformation business, but this whole system needs to be transformed. And no one would disagree with that. The way that people of color were being treated, what was going on the global stage around the world with China and and so I just felt like I needed to write about this. In my last chapter of the book, I got to the point. I wrote a really good book, but I got to the point in the last chapter of the book, which was the return to civil discourse. My dad used to say to me, if you have to shout over someone to get your point of view out there, you can't hold up your side of the argument. And we had people at our house, Mike, that were Democrats or Republicans, all different. And there was never this shouting. But I noticed the shouting, and the shouting got to be overwhelming.
Yes.
And I don't love it. And I wish we could stop it.
Yeah.
And so I wrote
I agree.
to head business leaders to step up to this, to don't let the global leaders be the last word, because they're not doing well, other than maybe a Zelensky and a few. There's too many bullies out there. I don't like it. And can we do something about this? We business leaders, can we do something about this? And in the recent economic forum, I wrote a little email to Jamie Dimon because he's a lifelong Democrat, but he had a lot of good things to say about both sides. And he was remarkable. And I wrote him and I said, you rocked it, you crushed it. And we need more leaders like that to speak out and to say what's wrong with this conversation.
Yeah.
And it's not getting any better. I can't even watch this news. It's just, and then newscasters in our day, Mike, how many newscasters got taken off the network?
Right.
I mean,
they were there. They were there for years, Yeah.
I never heard of this. And I'm like, what? And I'm almost glad my dad's not alive to see this, because I think, what would he think of a country that he fought so hard to save to be like this? My brother's a Vietnam hero. Certainly wasn't when he came home. But all of this is just, it's bugging me. So I think that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, I am sure I've not read it yet. I've read excerpts. I ordered it, and I'm sure more than a few are going to order it after the result of this conversation. Can you just tell us, very high level, 2 or 3 most important concepts? They're all important, or you wouldn't have written them, but 2 or 3 that you'd like to talk a little bit about right now?
Yeah. So one of them that I talk about, 4 considerations that exist in business, and I think they should exist on the world stage, both for businesses and individuals. First thing is to always ask yourself, is this relevant? Is my business relevant? Am I relevant? Is what I'm saying relevant? Can I grow my business? Because I can't grow it if it's not relevant. Kodak had their moment, right? When they decided not to go into digital photography. We use it as an example. Blockbusters made money punishing their customers with late fees. This is silly, okay? You don't grow that way. You are not relevant as a nation if what you're talking about, the only thing you're talking about is the other guy. Not about you and what you can do to make this a better place, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and some of the earlier presidents did. What do we need to do? Winston Churchill, what do we need to do to make this better? Relevance, growth, scale, and profitability. And not just profitability dollars wise, but is this a profitable way in which we're having this conversation? So I wrote about the 4 considerations of business, and I tell them everything else is noise. The other big concept, the 4 considerations: relevance, growth, scale, profitability, which includes productivity. If you can concentrate on those 4 things, you can run a good business. You don't need to know a lot more. Just figure that out. Every CEO is responsible for relevance, and all the operators are responsible for growth. So when a CEO says, my responsibility is to grow this business, not true. Your responsibility is to make sure your business is relevant now and in the future. Second big concept is the layers of a conversation: worldviews, standards, concerns. I write about that in the chocolate conversation. I write about it again in the new book. Everybody has a worldview. We don't know that worldview till we see people's standards. Worldviews get made visible through standards. So I worked with one CEO. If you were on time, you were late. He had a standard that you had to be there 5 minutes early. I grew up with that with my father. Be up at 0600 and ready for company. That was the only law he had. Covered a lot of bases. I got that. So I knew what his worldview was. Don't waste my time. Don't show up here. You got a 9 o'clock meeting, you don't slide in at 9 o'clock, okay? So that's a worldview and a standard. And then I realized when people moan and groan, I often hear my leaders say, oh, this guy came and threw up all over my desk, or they got on Zoom and carried on. Underneath every concern or complaint is an unmet need. Whether it's a customer screaming, one of your employees, any number of things, the United States, any number of our citizens. If people are complaining, they have unmet needs. So I speak in the book about the concept of stopping and thinking about, don't start with your worldview. Because Mike and I may agree, but not everybody shares that worldview. And when you start with your worldview, you open up to argument, not conversation. When you start with the unmet need, you start with the opportunity for a conversation. So if I say to somebody, what do you need? That gives them the opportunity to share what's missing. Then I can build from there and say, okay, how can I solve for that? And maybe create a new standard and reframe their worldview. Stephen Jobs did it beautifully. You and I never knew we needed 1,000 songs in our pocket. We didn't go to bed crying over that. But he knew the world needed something to entertain them. And he wanted it small so you could take it with you. Sony should have done it. Apple did. Yeah. And so he would start with an unmet need that you didn't even know you had. And then set a whole new standard for the industry, like visual voicemail. I can't live without it now. And then reframed people's worldviews. So a good leader can do that. A good leader goes into a situation, looks at what's wrong, figures out what the unmet needs are, starts to try to solve for those, sets a new standard, and reframes the worldview, not the other way around. Those are a couple things that are in the book that I think are worth reading.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I wrote this one down because I didn't want to forget verbatim. You encourage leaders to embrace constructive dissent, promote inclusivity, and create a culture where authentic, respectful conversation can happen. And I don't know any leader that wouldn't want to do that. The trick is, how do you do it? How do you get it done? So in a nutshell, Rose, high level, what actions can leaders take to cultivate and maintain such a culture?
Yeah, and this is tough, but it starts with listening and asking questions, not sharing your point of view. I keep going back to this. For someone to be authentic and have a respectful conversation, they got to acknowledge the other person's perspective. And very often you don't get that. You just get someone telling you what they think. Or as my friend Jill says, a colleague of ours in the Jill Vanderputten, listening is not waiting for your turn to talk. I know it's been around for a while, but when you actually listen to someone, it goes all the way back to Macbeth, that you might tell my story, that you might hear me. You know, it's just such a wonderful thing, isn't it? To just have that sense that you're being listened to. I think if leaders listened more, asked more questions, stepped back, reflected, and actually didn't have to have the immediate response, but say, you've given me something to think about. Let me come back to you. Just that little bit. It sounds like common sense, but common sense, as Stephen Covey has often said, is not common practice.
Yeah, I love that. And throwing a personal anecdote out, I mean, I've been, I've been in charge of a lot of things. I've got a lot of leadership experience. And I tell everybody that'll listen, Rose, the one skill that I really wish that I would have gotten better at earlier, and I would have been even more successful, was the art of listening. It's not that I didn't listen or wasn't willing to listen, but I was so confident in my abilities that I often did listen, waiting for the other person to, because I already had the answer in my mind. 10 words into their homily, I already knew what I was going to say. So I was listening to get my chance to talk until I was probably in my late 40s. I worked for an executive who was very seasoned, had been in a lot of big companies, and that guy had the art of listening down pat. He not only would let me in our one-on-one meetings speak for 20 minutes if I had to, but he had a memory to where he could say, okay, Mike, so what I'm hearing is A, B, C, and D. You said this, and let's talk about that. It just showed me I could talk for 20 minutes, and he was listening.
Absolutely.
And you know what? He was so experienced, Rose, that I got to believe most of the time he had most of the answers 5 minutes into my speech, but he listened and let me talk. And I think there were times that, well, maybe in minute 18, I said something that negated what he would have said in the first 5 minutes. So I really point that at myself. And I'm saying this not for your benefit, obviously, but for the benefit of the listeners. It is a learned skill. And if you can master the art of applying it, I think you will become a much more effective leader much quicker. Any last thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think even as husbands and wives, as significant others together, um, friendships, the worst thing on earth is to not feel listened to, and when you talked about this man, he acknowledged what you said and he was building off of it. All of a
Yes.
sudden you're like kind of shocked. Somebody's actually listening to me. They're building off of. So I'd like to move away from dialogue, which came from the ancient Greek, right? Having a dialogue meant that you were exchanging, but you were building off the other. Instead, we end up with dueling monologues. You go on the
Yeah.
news, you got dueling monologues. Let me tell you what I think. Oh, this is what I think. And I even say it to my husband, Ron, did you just hear what I said? Do you think you could just build off of what I just said or acknowledge that you heard it? Because I'm not interested in a new thought right now. I want to talk about it. And we love each other very much, 46 years of marriage, but it is one of those things that really is my nemesis. I really want someone to know I've heard them. I want them to know that I care. I was talking with someone very recently that I have had a really wonderful relationship with and learned as much from as they may have from me. And I remembered what a beautiful thing he did at a meeting that we were at. We were at a dinner and he ordered the person's food who was coming late to make sure that they were going to get something to eat. And then this guy had shot in a really kind of nasty email to his boss, and the boss was a little taken back. And he said, you know what? Maybe he's having a bad day. Gave that person the benefit of the doubt. And I remembered that and I shared it back, and it was like, can't believe that you remember that. I said, well, it struck me. It struck me. It's such a wonderful leadership skill.
Yeah.
There's a beauty in having someone pay attention and bring it back to you. So, and I, like you, was not particularly great at it when I was younger, although it was pushed on me by my dad. I have to say that was one of the things I worked hard at, as my father. It meant so much to him.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of type A confident people, they usually do have many of the answers and all of that. And I think it's not natural to suppress that because you're a go-getter, you know you can make a difference, you want to help and all of that. And I'm the type of person, I've described myself, I'm the kind of person as a leader, I go around looking for problems. What do you need? I can help you with, I
I
want
love
to
it.
add value. I mean, I want to add value. I'm aggressively seeking out their problems. And when sometimes I'll learn more about their problems and can better help them solve it if I just listen to them, let them talk. So, anyway, I'm fascinated by your concept of framing conversations. And you say that it consists of technical, social, and political spheres to frame these conversations with those three spheres to effectively share ideas and build trust. I'm not sure that I have, you know, grasped it fully. Can you give me an example? Give us an example of a framed conversation.
Yeah. Um, I write an example in the actual book. So
Okay.
I'll leave that to you, that example. But if you've watched the movie Hidden Figures, it follows very close to the truth. And when Mary Jackson goes in to speak to the judge, not Catherine, the main character, but Mary Jackson wants to be an engineer. And her Jewish boss says to her, look, I had to overcome the Holocaust and everything else to get here to NASA. I know you're a woman of color, but you got to get this. You got to go to an all-white high school and take some classes. So she's going before a judge, and it's really worth watching this clip. I use it in a lot of my workshops. And technically, she's got all of the right knowledge, experience, and skills to deserve the right to educate herself. Socially, she's got to connect with a guy who's lived with this bias for a lot of years in the South. And politically, she's got to position it in a way that it's a win-win. This conversation is probably one of the best examples of reframing. She goes to the judge and he's shocked when he sees her because he doesn't realize she's a woman of color. He knows she's coming from NASA, so he just assumes. And she's standing in the galley behind the gate. And the judge says to her, you're here to make a petition to go to an all-white high school? And she says, I believe there are extenuating circumstances. I know it's never been done before. No, never. And then he proceeds to tell her that even though there's a Civil Rights Act going on, our law is the law in the state. May I approach the bench? First thing, am I having this conversation in an environment that's conducive to the other person being willing to hear it? How many times somebody blurts something out at a meeting in a public forum and they don't stand a chance in hell of getting the answer they want to get, okay? Yeah. Pick your space, pick your spot. Then you walk in, she approaches the bench, and she begins to share with the judge all the things he's done to be first. You were first to go to university, you were first to be commanded in the armed forces, you were first to do this. And he looks at her, he says, you've done your homework. And she says, yes. And she said, I have no choice but to be first. I can't change the color of my skin, and I need to go to that all-white high school. So she's now connecting with him on a human level where they both have something in common. The last piece of it, which he's definitely not there yet, Mike, and this is true story. She says to him, of all the cases you're going to hear for today, which one is going to make you the first 100 years from now? And this guy's always been first. So he bends down and he says, only the night classes. Only the night classes. And she walks out of there elated. That's a preparation for a very serious conversation. In the technical sphere, it's what I know. In the social sphere, it's how I connect what I know to who I know.
Yeah.
In the political sphere, it's how I get someone to know me. It's where one is your professional expertise, the other is your network, and the other is your standing. How can I be an opinion shaper? How can I change things? And the technical sphere is fine when you first go into a job, but if you don't hone that social skill, where you can socialize ideas, where you can collaborate, where you can then position things in a way that people will see you differently. It happened with Zelensky. He reframed that conversation, didn't he? It happens all the time in business.
Yes.
That's what I talk about in the book. And you need to have those three skills. You have to have them. Can't operate in one.
Yeah, well said. Well, Rose, you've been involved, you've led, you've been led, you've observed, you've trained, developed so many, you've been exposed to so many leaders. And I hate to use the terms good and bad, maybe effective and less effective. Let's face it, there are bad leaders out there. Um, let's talk about the very best, the top slice of the very best that you've ever been exposed to. Have you identified any traits and habits that most of the very, very best leaders share in common?
Yes. And we've talked about several of them, right? Good listener, willing to be vulnerable, able to tell you they've made a mistake. I stand corrected. I didn't do that quite right. They're willing to go first. So we saw that in the first responders when those leaders went into that building ahead of everyone else. I'll go first. Where they live it and walk it more than they talk it. And those are the kind of people, courage, a level of courage, a willing to take a risk, seeing multiple points of view, able to translate really well, not just communicate, complex concepts, strategies, making it simple. I'm sorry to say I met a lot more of those leaders earlier in my career than I have later.
Wow. How about, Rose, the other side of the coin? Those that are the least effective, do they have any? Did you spot any traits and habits that most of them seem to have in common as well?
Yeah, particularly today, always obviously people who have bully kinds of I'm the boss kind of thing. And bosses get compliance and leaders get commitment, right? So I love it when somebody is earnestly telling you what they feel and you're on your phone, texting a message, answering an email. I've seen it. I've seen it. Where you cut somebody off before they've even had a chance to finish what they're saying. Where you're MIA, you're not around. I've got one leader we work with that seems to leave every time something important is happening, and the people are left sort of holding it, whether they have to talk at a stockholders meeting or at a board meeting. What we would refer to as absentee leadership. They're MIA. They delegate everything under the guise of empowerment. Yeah, I mean, spend more time on what they need than you need. I think that, and that throughout the career, you've met that type.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I want to ask a follow-on question to that. You really piqued my interest on this. I'm big on delegation. The Marine Corps was big on delegation, push the
Yes.
power down because there's not enough officers to go around, and they're probably going to be dead or wounded anyway. That's how I was taught. So corporals and sergeants are going to run the show for the most part. And I find that especially among you newer leaders or less confident, maybe even 4 or 5 year leaders, I tell them to delegate, but one of their biggest fears, Mike, I want my people's respect. And how do I delegate and not have them interpret it as me shirking? Am I truly delegating because I know they can handle it and I'll help them if they need it, but to let them run with it and develop it, they got it. They're capable. Or we've all seen the leaders that I'm going to delegate, and really it's because I don't want to do it and I'm shirking. I don't want to do my job. I'm taking a day off. I'm going to go home to my family, or I'm going to go have a coffee, or whatever the case may be. And I'm not sure that I answer them all that effectively, to be honest with you. I wanted to get your input. What's your advice to the younger developing leaders? Their fear of, I want to delegate, but I don't want to ever come off as I'm shirking or just dumping something, a problem on something, and I'm really not there to help them. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the first conversation is always critical. Engaging someone in what you're asking them to do, right? So being very clear about what the outcome is. What outcome are we driving? What problem are we solving for? And what outcome do we hope to gain? Putting your faith in someone and saying, look, I think you've got an opportunity here to stretch. I'm available if you need me.
Yeah.
But here's a clear understanding of what I need you to do. And it's not about micromanaging, but it is about setting some goals, objectives, outcomes,
Yeah.
and giving a little bit of the path to getting there. So that's never about shirking. That's then about people love to have you put, when you do that with a young child. And my son was a much better photographer than I was at age 5. But he had an ability, and he ended up doing this kind of thing with lighting and all. It was amazing. But I used to set him up and say, Zach, you take the picture because it's not going to come out good if mommy does it. It just made him feel like a big piece of stuff. And you know what? It's a wonderful thing. So you can't empower anyone. No one can give someone power. What someone can do is create the conditions for someone to empower themselves. But you can delegate. I remember Dad telling me a story very quickly. He was 18 years old. They were landing on Guadalcanal, and the Marines had to play all positions. You were one. So just because he was a tail gunner didn't mean he didn't do ground. So they were all going, and he was really nervous because it's a little different when you're up in the plane. And his commanding officer saw it, and he looked at him and he said, Marine, you scared, and don't lie to me. My father turned around. Yes, sir. He said, good. Fear will save you and your brothers. Then he looked over at him and he said, you got butterflies? He said, yes, sir. He said, you're a Marine. Make sure they're flying in formation. So it was just a moment. And then he took all of them aside, and they were all there waiting to go in. And they were literally going to relieve the Army or help them, not relieve them, but go in and be part of the campaign. And he said, you have been trained for what we're asking you to do. And, they go through the whole building someone up, right? And he says, you are in the most prestigious arm of the military. You are United States Marines. Watch your 6, go in, take care of business. You know what to do. You've been trained to do this. And there was still a lot of fear, obviously, but they went in and they heard the Army buddies yelling, it's the Marines, it's the Marines, the Marines have come to help, because they were being ambushed. I think Jolie wrote about it when she wrote about that man who got captured in Guadalcanal, but that was one of the islands my dad landed on. After they did that skirmish, and it was a 3-day deal, I think, they came back. And Dad said there was a makeshift campaign in the camp. And 4 of the Marines were walking toward there, but they were all Army guys, and they weren't sure how it was going to go because, there was always that sort of military, competitiveness. And he said they walked in and everything got very quiet. They were sitting on crates and had some bottles. And one guy jumped off his crate, saluted, and started singing the Marine anthem. And Dad told me it was the one time he cried, could hardly hold it back. And then one by one they got off, and they paid them homage for what they had done. I think everyone deserves that opportunity in life. And that commanding officer did something very special that day because he gave them the strength and the inspiration they needed to go do something very difficult. I think it's all on the way you do it, and it's the way in which you share how you want something done.
Yeah, I love it. Well, listen, our time's up, Rose, but I can't let you out of here without asking the question I ask of everybody. If you were able to spend a day with one leader from the past, you could bring somebody back, who would you choose and
And
why?
that's one of the hardest questions because I have a few of them. I'd love to sit with Patton. I'd love to sit with Churchill, Golda. Um, I'm amazed by these people, and I would love to be able to sit down with them and go through it because I know that Winston Churchill died kind of sad
Yeah,
because he wasn't fully respected for everything he had done, and de Gaulle and
right.
Roosevelt did not treat him well in the end. Patton, he was not honored for, I thought he was amazing. I really did.
Yeah,
And Golda, she killed herself with all those cigarettes, but an amazing woman. And, yeah, I'd love to sit down with people like that and just get
yeah.
the gist of what makes them tick, and it would be wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. Great choice. Yes, I agree entirely. All we can do now is read, and if they're not that long gone, we can still watch videos and things like that. But I love it. As you know, we talked early before we recorded about the Stoicism and the ancients and the Greeks and all of that. I think, the old timers back then, they had life pretty much figured out. And, you read these ancient quotes 2000 years ago and, with little modification, they had it nailed. They have human nature nailed.
Because they had wisdom.
Yeah.
Anybody can toss around their intellect. These were ancient wisdom. I mean, obviously, if we could sit down with a Marcus
Yeah.
Aurelius, wouldn't that be amazing?
Yes.
Because he really had wisdom, and I think they were assisted, and they had direct contact with those away from here, higher
Yeah.
powers. I really do. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. In fact, that the ancient wisdom term, that's the title of my book on
I
Stoicism,
love
Ancient
that.
Wisdom.
I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. Love it. Love it.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, listen, Rose, are people, or I'm sure, going to want to contact you? Where can they find your books? How do they reach out to you if they desire to?
Yeah, we can definitely reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I do respond. And I don't have
Yeah.
someone else respond. I respond. And the book can be got on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or direct from our website. You just go online and order it.
Yes. Well, listen, it's been a fascinating conversation. And as a Marine, 24 years in uniform, I'm so appreciative. I just hope that I selfishly hope that my children have such memories of me that you do of your dad. Because the
I
minute
think
I
that,
started researching you, I just started realizing, he certainly made an impression on her.
well, I'm 75 years old, and my dad died just short of his 90th birthday. And then my mom passed when she was 95,
Mm,
4 days short of her 96th birthday. So I'm very fortunate to have had them as long as I did. And
yeah.
yep, I'm about to be 75 in April, so a lot going on here. But it
Yeah,
was wonderful talking
absolutely.
to you.
Yes. Well, fascinating conversation. The audience will love it, I'm sure. Rose, selfishly, I can't thank you enough, but selfishly, I would ask you to consider coming back again someday and let's do it
I would
again.
love to. I would love to. And I'd love you to come back and talk to some of our people. I think they would enjoy it. And I love your books, really.
I love it. Well, thanks again, Rose, and have a great
Okay.
day.
You too.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please subscribe, rate, review, and recommend to your friends. Please visit our website at fidelisleadership.com and sign up for our leadership newsletter. Until next time, remember the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Pericles.
What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but is woven in the lives of others.